single mother was forced to give up her baby's milk, but what happened next stunned an entire community. No one noticed her at first. Under the harsh lights of a crowded supermarket, Eleanor Vance clutched a worn wallet in her trembling hands. At just 27, she carried the weight of the world alone. Her daughter, Daisy, needed a special formula, one Eleanor could barely afford. As the cashier announced the total, her heart sank. "I'm sorry, I have to put this one back." With tears burning her eyes, she slid the can of formula back across the counter, whispering an apology no mother should ever have to make. Behind her, impatience filled the air. But what Eleanor didn't know was that a stranger was watching, a man whose next decision would alter not just her night, but the course of her entire life. A single can of formula stood between a mother's promise and utter defeat. Eleanor Vance knew the price down to the last cent before the cashier even scanned it. But knowing the cost and accepting the reality were two very different battles, and today, she was losing. The giant, fluorescent lights of the megamart hummed a low, buzzing song. It was a tune of indifference, a sound that filled the vast space but offered no comfort. For Eleanor, it was the soundtrack to her rising panic. At 27, she often felt as though the entire weight of the world had settled upon her shoulders, a burden that was both heavy and hers alone. Her daughter, Daisy, was nearly a year old. She was a perfect, tiny miracle with a button nose and eyes the color of a summer sky. Daisy was the single, unwavering light in Eleanor's life, the reason for every sacrifice, every long hour, every quiet prayer. But today, even the thought of Daisy's smile couldn't cut through the thick fog of their circumstances. Eleanor stood in the checkout line, her worn shopping cart containing the absolute necessities. There was a loaf of store-brand bread, a small container of oatmeal, a bag of frozen vegetables, and 2 jars of baby food. And then there was the formula. It was a large, blue can of a specific hypoallergenic brand. The doctor had insisted on it. Daisy had a sensitive system, and the cheaper formulas left her crying in pain for hours. The can felt like a luxury, a splurge she wrestled with every single week. Eleanor had promised herself she would always make it work. She would eat less. She would work more. She would do whatever it took to provide this small, essential comfort for her baby girl. The cashier, a young man with a bored expression and a name tag that read Kevin, began scanning her items. Beep. The bread. Beep. The oatmeal. Beep. The vegetables. With each sound, the numbers on the small screen climbed higher and higher. Eleanor's hands, gripping the cart handle, grew damp. She squeezed the thin, cracked leather of her wallet in her coat pocket. It had been her great-grandfather's, a man who had fought in a war that most people had forgotten. Inside it, a few wrinkled dollar bills and a small handful of change were all she had to last until her next paycheck. "Will that be all for you today?" Kevin asked, his voice flat. Eleanor nodded, her throat suddenly tight. He grabbed the can of formula. The scanner beeped, louder this time, more final. "That's $31.42, he announced. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. She had counted her money 3 times before she left her tiny apartment. She knew, deep down, that she was short. She had been hoping for a sale, for a coupon she'd forgotten, for some small miracle. But miracles felt like they were for other people, for lives much different than her own. Shame, hot and sharp, washed over her. The people behind her were shifting, their carts rattling with an impatient rhythm. I'm sorry," she stammered, the words barely audible. "I have to put something back." Kevin's expression didn't change. He simply waited, his hand hovering over the keyboard. This was just another part of his job. He saw this happen every day. The quiet apology, the fumbling hands, the averted eyes. It was a scene as old as the invention of the cash register. With a hand that trembled, Eleanor reached forward. She placed her fingers on the cool metal of the formula can. It felt impossibly heavy, like it was filled with lead instead of powder. Her heart ached with a physical pain, a sharp pang of failure that stole her breath. In that small, ordinary moment, under the harsh, uncaring lights of the megamart, Eleanor felt like the worst mother in the world. She was failing her daughter. "This one," she said, her voice cracking as she pushed the can toward the cashier. "I need to put this one back." She refused to look at him. She couldn't bear to see the flicker of pity that might be in his eyes. She fumbled with her wallet, her fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. She could feel the stares of the other shoppers, a wave of silent judgment that made her wish the polished linoleum floor would crack open and swallow her. A few yards away, pretending to examine a display of organic juices, stood James Caldwell. To anyone who glanced his way, he was just a man in a simple but well-made gray coat. He was in his late 30s, with thoughtful eyes and a quiet air of authority. But James was much more than that. He was a titan of the tech industry, a billionaire whose innovations were in homes and offices all over the world. His face occasionally appeared in financial magazines, though he hated the publicity and did everything he could to avoid it. Clutching his hand was his 5-year-old daughter, Sophia. She was a small girl with her father's serious eyes and a head of curly brown hair. Sophia was the center of James's universe. She was the anchor that kept him grounded in a life that was often filled with unimaginable wealth and a profound, crushing loneliness. They were in the store for a simple, almost silly reason. Sophia had decided that only one specific brand of organic apple juice would do, and that brand was only sold at Megamart. James's personal assistant could have had a truckload of the juice delivered to their home with a single text message. But Sophia had looked up at him with her big, pleading eyes and said, "I want to go with you, Daddy." And James, a man who built empires but was powerless against his daughter's wishes, had agreed immediately. He had been watching Eleanor for a few minutes. He was a silent observer of her quiet, desperate struggle. He noticed the way her hands trembled as she clutched her wallet. He saw the flicker of shame that crossed her face as the total was announced. He had seen poverty, of course. He donated millions to charities that worked to fight it. He sat on boards and attended fundraisers. But it was always an abstract concept, a problem to be solved with data and dollars. He had never seen it this close. He had never witnessed its raw, personal, and heartbreaking reality. He saw her slide the can of formula across the counter. And in that moment, something deep inside his chest, a part of his heart he thought had gone dormant long ago, stirred with a feeling he couldn't immediately identify. It was more than just pity. It was a strange and powerful ache of compassion. "Daddy," Sophia whispered, pulling on his coat. "Why does that lady look so sad?" James looked down at his daughter's innocent, questioning face. How could he possibly explain the harsh unfairness of the world to a child who had never wanted for anything? How could he explain that some mothers had to choose between feeding themselves and buying the right food for their babies? "She's just having a difficult day, sweetie," he said, his voice soft and low. He watched as Eleanor paid for her few items. Her shoulders were slumped as if carrying a great weight. She took her single plastic bag, her head bowed low, and walked toward the exit. She moved like a ghost, a shadow trying to be invisible in a world that had already overlooked her. And in that moment, James Caldwell, a man who could buy anything he desired, made a decision. He was not going to let this woman, this stranger, disappear into the night. He was not going to let her carry that burden alone. He didn't know exactly why. He just knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to do something. He knelt down to Sophia's level. "Sweetheart, I need you to wait right here with Mr. Henderson for just a minute," he said, nodding toward the store's security guard at the entrance. The guard, a kind-faced man who was discreetly on James's personal payroll for times like this, gave a small nod. Sophia trusted Mr. Henderson, so she agreed without a fuss. James walked with a new sense of purpose back to the checkout lane. He picked up the can of formula Eleanor had left behind. He also grabbed a few other things from the nearby aisles: a warm rotisserie chicken, a bag of fresh apples, a loaf of artisan bread, and a box of Sophia's favorite cookies. He paid for everything in cash, then walked out of the store into the chilly evening air. His eyes scanned the vast, brightly lit parking lot, searching for the sad young woman with the weight of the world on her shoulders. He found her at a bus stop on the far edge of the lot. She sat on the cold metal bench, her small grocery bag at her feet. She was staring off into the distance, her expression lost and empty. She looked so small against the vast, dark expanse of the parking lot. He approached her carefully, his footsteps quiet on the pavement. He didn't want to frighten her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. Eleanor jumped, startled. She looked up, and her eyes widened in confusion. She saw a tall, well-dressed man holding 2 grocery bags. Her first thought was that he was from the store, that she had somehow done something wrong. "I think you might have forgotten this," James said gently, holding out the bag that contained the can of formula. Eleanor stared at the can, then back at the man's face. A fresh wave of embarrassment washed over her, and her cheeks burned. I didn't forget it, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I couldn't afford it. I know, James said, his voice kind. That's why I bought it for you. Eleanor was stunned into silence. She looked at the man, at the sincere concern in his eyes. There was no pity there, only a quiet understanding. She didn't know what to say. In her life, kindness from a stranger was not something she had ever encountered. It felt foreign, suspicious. I can't take that, she finally said, her pride rising up like a shield. It was the only thing she had left. Please, James said, his voice earnest. It's just some formula. Your daughter should have it. He glanced at the small, pink diaper bag sitting next to her on the bench. You have a little one, right? Eleanor nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Her name is Daisy. That's a beautiful name, James said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. I have a daughter, too. Her name is Sophia. She's 5. He extended the bag to her again. Please, think of it as a gift from one parent to another. Eleanor hesitated. Her pride was at war with the fierce, protective love she had for her daughter. Daisy needed that formula. In the end, it wasn't a choice at all. Her daughter's well-being was the only thing that mattered. With tears clouding her vision, she reached out and took the bag. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, James said. But it's cold out here, and that bus can take a while. I'd be happy to give you a ride home. My car is just over there. He gestured toward a sleek, dark gray car parked in a nearby spot. It was understated but clearly expensive. A driver stood patiently by its side. Eleanor was completely overwhelmed. The formula was one thing. A ride home in a car that likely cost more than she made in 5 years was another. Oh no, I couldn't possibly, she said, shaking her head. The bus should be here soon. Really? I insist, James said, his tone gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. It's getting dark. It is no trouble at all. Let me help you with your bag. Before Eleanor could protest again, he reached down and picked up her other grocery bag. His fingers brushed against hers for a brief second, and a strange, unexpected warmth shot up her arm. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time. She saw past the expensive coat and the confident demeanor. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion around his kind eyes. She saw a hint of a deep-seated sadness that even his gentle smile couldn't completely hide. He wasn't just a rich man playing the part of a good Samaritan. There was something more to him, something she couldn't quite understand. Feeling as though she were in a dream, she allowed him to lead her toward the car. The driver, a professional man with a stone-like expression, opened the back door for her. The interior of the car was another world entirely. It was quiet and warm, and it smelled of clean leather and something else she couldn't identify, the subtle scent of wealth. It was both comforting and deeply intimidating. James retrieved Sophia, who climbed into the back seat, and looked at Eleanor with wide, curious eyes. Sophia, this is Ms. Vance, James said to his daughter. She and her daughter are going to ride home with us. Hello, Sophia said, her voice a tiny, shy whisper. Hi, Sophia, Eleanor replied, a genuine smile finally reaching her lips. It's very nice to meet you. The ride to Eleanor's apartment complex was mostly silent, but it wasn't awkward. James asked for her address, and she gave it to him, feeling a fresh pang of shame as she pictured her worn-down building in a part of town he had probably never driven through. But James didn't react. He simply gave the address to his driver and then engaged Sophia in a quiet game of I Spy, his voice a low, soothing murmur. Eleanor watched them. She saw the obvious, deep love between the father and his daughter. It was a beautiful thing to witness. And yet, she still saw that profound loneliness in his eyes, a loneliness she recognized because she felt it in her own heart every day. When they pulled up in front of her building, a plain, 3-story brick structure with cracked concrete steps, James insisted on carrying her bags to her door. You've already done so much, Eleanor protested weakly. I can manage from here. I'm sure you can, he said with a small smile. But I'd like to help. His quiet authority was impossible to argue with. He followed her up the 2 flights of stairs. The hallway was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, and the air smelled of old carpets and cooking odors. It was a world away from the clean, quiet interior of his car. When they reached her apartment at the end of the hall, she fumbled in her pocket for her keys, her hands still shaking slightly. She was intensely aware of the peeling paint on her door, the worn-out welcome mat, the general shabbiness of her surroundings. She finally got the door open, and a happy gurgle came from inside. From a playpen in the corner of the small living room, Daisy pushed herself up, her face lighting up at the sight of her mother. "Mama," she babbled. Eleanor's heart swelled. All the shame and embarrassment of the evening melted away. She scooped her daughter into her arms, burying her face in Daisy's soft hair. She was home. She was safe. This was all that mattered. She turned to James, who was standing in the doorway, a thoughtful, unreadable expression on his face. "This is Daisy," Eleanor said, her voice soft. James smiled, a real, warm smile that completely transformed his face. "She's perfect," he said. His gaze swept around the small apartment. It was cramped and sparsely furnished, but it was also spotlessly clean. A few framed photos sat on a small bookshelf next to a stack of library books for children. He saw a home that was filled with an abundance of love, if not with material things. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a stranger's humble apartment, James Caldwell felt a sense of human connection, of something real and genuine that he hadn't felt in a very long time. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep within him, that this was not just a random act of kindness. This was something more. He handed her the grocery bags. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Eleanor," he said, using her first name. "Thank you again," she said, her voice full of a gratitude so pure it touched him more than any lavish praise he had ever received. "You truly have no idea what this meant to me tonight." "I think I do," he said, his eyes meeting hers. In that brief, shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them. It was a moment of recognition, a shared humanity that bridged the vast, unspoken gap between their two worlds. He left her then, walking back down the dimly lit stairs and out into the cool night. As his car pulled away from the curb, a strange and unfamiliar feeling blossomed in his chest. It felt like hope. He didn't know it yet, but that chance encounter in a grocery store, that simple can of formula, was not an ending. It was the beginning of a story that would change both of their lives in ways neither could ever have imagined. The days following the encounter at the Megamart felt different for Eleanor. The oppressive gray fog of despair that had become her constant companion seemed to have lifted, even if just a little. It was replaced by a sliver of light, a warmth that had less to do with the charity she had received and more to do with the simple, undeniable fact that someone had seen her. In a world that had made her feel invisible, a stranger had looked at her and seen a person, a mother, a human being worthy of a moment of kindness. That night, after putting Daisy to bed, Eleanor sat in her small, quiet living room. The can of formula stood on her kitchen counter, a silent testament to the strange and surreal evening. She made herself a cup of tea and held the warm mug in her hands, replaying the entire event in her mind. The man's name was James. His daughter's name was Sophia. That's all she knew. She would likely never see him again. He was a ship passing in the night, a brief, bright light in her vast, dark sea. And yet, his act had done more than just provide for Daisy's immediate needs. It had sparked something within Eleanor, a dormant ember of hope that she thought had long since turned to ash. For months, she had been trapped in a cycle of survival. Wake up, get Daisy ready, drop her at the sitter's, work a grueling 8-hour shift at the diner, pick Daisy up, come home, cook, clean, sleep, and repeat. Her job paid just enough to keep a roof over their heads and a little food on the table. There was never anything left over. There was no room for dreams, no space for anything beyond the crushing weight of the present moment. But now, a new thought began to take root in her mind. It was a fragile, tentative idea, but it was there nonetheless. She deserved more. Daisy deserved more. Her great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael Vance, had fought for a country that promised opportunity. He had been a hero, a man of courage and principle. She had his photograph on her bookshelf, a young man in a crisp uniform, his eyes full of a fierce, unwavering resolve. She had grown up on stories of his bravery. What would he think of her now, barely scraping by, too afraid to even hope for a better life? The next morning, Eleanor woke with a new sense of determination. She made Daisy breakfast, her movements more purposeful, her spirit lighter. While Daisy napped, Eleanor didn't turn on the television to numb her exhaustion. Instead, she sat down at her small, wobbly kitchen table with a pen and a piece of paper. She began to write down her skills. She was a hard worker. She was reliable. She was good with people. Before Daisy was born, she had worked as a receptionist at a small law firm. She had been good at it. She was organized and efficient. But the pay had been too low to cover childcare, so she had been forced to leave. She pulled out the local newspaper and began circling classified ads. She searched for jobs online using the slow, spotty Wi-Fi from the coffee shop downstairs. Most required a degree she didn't have or experience she couldn't claim. The familiar wave of discouragement began to creep in, but this time, Eleanor pushed it back. She wouldn't give up. Not today. She found an ad for an administrative assistant at a local community center, one that helped support veterans and their families. The pay was slightly better than the diner, and the hours were more regular. But more than that, the work felt meaningful. It felt like something her great-grandfather would have been proud of. With a deep breath, she began to craft a resume, her first in over 2 years. Meanwhile, across town, in a sprawling, minimalist mansion overlooking the city, James Caldwell was also finding it difficult to forget the encounter at the megamart. His life was a carefully curated world of boardrooms, investment portfolios, and high-stakes negotiations. It was a world of immense privilege and profound isolation. His wife, Isabella, had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving a void in his life that no amount of success or wealth could ever fill. Sophia was his anchor, his reason for being, but the day-to-day work of raising a child was largely handled by a team of nannies and housekeepers. He was a father, but he often felt more like a CEO in his own home. The image of Eleanor in the grocery store was burned into his memory. He saw her quiet dignity, the fierce pride in her eyes, even as she was forced to make an impossible choice. He saw the overwhelming love she had for her daughter, a love so powerful it was almost a physical presence in her small, clean apartment. He had felt more human in those 10 minutes in her hallway than he had in the last 3 years of sterile boardrooms and empty charity galas. He found himself thinking about her throughout the day. During a conference call with his international team, he stared out his floor-to-ceiling window and wondered if she had found a job yet. While reviewing financial projections, he pictured Daisy's bright, happy face and Sophia's shy smile. He felt a pull, a strange and insistent need to know that she was all right. This was new for him. He was a man who solved problems with logic and capital. He wrote checks. He funded initiatives. He did not get personally involved in the lives of strangers. But Eleanor didn't feel like a stranger. He felt as though he had seen a part of her soul, a glimpse into a life of quiet struggle and profound love that resonated with a deep, unmet longing in his own. He wanted to help her, but he knew he had to be careful. He had seen the pride in her eyes. The last thing he wanted to do was to offend her or make her feel like a charity case. A simple handout would be an insult to her strength. He did something he rarely did. He used his vast resources for a personal inquiry. He asked his head of security, a trusted former FBI agent named David, to discreetly find out more about Eleanor Vance. He didn't want a full investigation, just some basic information. He needed to know that she and Daisy were safe. He told himself it was just a loose end, a need for closure. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. A day later, David placed a thin manila folder on James's large, glass desk. "Here's the information you requested on Ms. Eleanor Vance, sir," David said, his voice neutral. James opened the folder, a strange sense of apprehension twisting in his gut. Inside, there were a few sheets of paper. Her address, her previous employment history, her lack of any criminal record. It was all very ordinary. And then he saw it. A short paragraph about her family. She was the great-granddaughter of Sergeant Michael Vance. James's breath caught in his throat. He knew that name. His own grandfather, Corporal Thomas Caldwell, had served in the same infantry division during the war. He had spoken of Sergeant Vance with a tone of reverence and awe. Michael Vance was a legend in their unit, a man who had single-handedly saved his entire platoon during a brutal, forgotten battle. Thomas had been one of the men he saved. He had owed his life to Eleanor's great-grandfather. James leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. This was not a coincidence. It couldn't be. It felt like a message from the past, a thread of connection that stretched across generations, linking his family to hers. His grandfather had spent the rest of his life feeling an immense debt of gratitude to Michael Vance, a debt he had never been able to repay. And now, James had stumbled upon his great-granddaughter, a young woman struggling to make ends meet, in the checkout line of a grocery store. The vague desire to help her solidified into an unshakable resolve. This was no longer just about a random act of kindness. This was about legacy. It was about honor. It was about repaying a debt that his family had carried for over 70 years. But how? He couldn't simply show up at her door with a check. That would cheapen the memory of their grandfather's shared sacrifice. He needed to find a way to help her that would give her a hand up, not a handout. He needed to create an opportunity, not an obligation. He spent the rest of the day in a state of deep thought. He canceled his afternoon meetings. He ignored the incessant pinging of his email. He looked at the photo on his desk, a picture of him and Sophia at a park, their faces bright with laughter. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be in his daughter's eyes. He didn't want to be just a name on a building or a figure in a magazine. He wanted to be a man of integrity, a man who understood the value of human connection, a man who honored the past and invested in the future. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office, he had a plan. It was unconventional. It was risky, but it felt right. He called David back into his office. "David," he began, his voice calm and clear. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to arrange a meeting." A week later, Eleanor received a phone call. It was from the Veterans Community Center where she had applied for the administrative assistant position. They wanted her to come in for an interview. Eleanor's heart leaped with a hopeful, fluttering excitement. She spent 2 days preparing. She ironed her only interview-appropriate blouse. She reviewed her resume until she had memorized every word. She arranged for her neighbor, a kind elderly woman, to watch Daisy for an hour. She walked into the community center with a mixture of hope and crippling anxiety. The center was a modest, welcoming place, its walls lined with photographs of local servicemen and women. She was led into a small office to meet the director, a warm, smiling woman named Mrs. Gable. The interview went well. Eleanor was able to speak about her great-grandfather, about her deep respect for the military, and about her genuine desire to be a part of an organization that did such important work. At the end of the interview, Mrs. Gable smiled at her. "You are a very impressive young woman, Eleanor. Your passion for this work is evident." She paused, her expression turning thoughtful. "The administrative position has actually just been filled." "I'm so sorry." Eleanor's heart sank. She had been so close. She tried to keep the disappointment from showing on her face. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Well, thank you for your time." She stood up to leave, the familiar weight of defeat settling back onto her shoulders. "But," Mrs. Gable said, holding up a hand, "another opportunity has just come up. It's a bit unusual." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. "Our biggest benefactor has recently established a new program. It's called the Vance Legacy Grant." Eleanor stared at the paper. Her own last name was printed in bold letters at the top. "The grant," Mrs. Gable continued, "is designed to support the direct descendants of local war heroes. It provides funding for education, career training, and a living stipend to help families get back on their feet. It's brand new. In fact, you would be the very first recipient. It seems our benefactor was made aware of your application and your connection to Sergeant Michael Vance. He was very insistent." Eleanor was speechless. She looked at the paper, then back at Mrs. Gable, her mind struggling to process what was happening. A grant? In her family's name? It felt like a dream. "Who?" Eleanor finally managed to ask. "Who is the benefactor?" Mrs. Gable smiled. "He prefers to remain anonymous. He simply believes in honoring our heroes and investing in their families. The grant is yours, Eleanor, if you want it. It would provide you with a monthly stipend, more than you would have made in the administrative position. It would also cover the cost of you going back to school, if that's something you'd want to do. It would give you a chance, a real chance, to build a new life for you and your daughter." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes. She thought of her great-grandfather. She thought of the man in the grocery store. She thought of the flicker of hope that had been ignited within her. This wasn't charity. This was an opportunity. This was a legacy. She looked at Mrs. Gable, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling but full of a new, unshakable strength. Yes, I want it. As she walked out of the community center and into the bright afternoon sun, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. She didn't know who the anonymous benefactor was, but she sent a silent prayer of gratitude out into the universe. She didn't know that the man who had bought her a can of formula was the same man who had just given her a future. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, the path ahead was not dark and uncertain. It was illuminated by the bright, warm light of possibility. And she was ready to take the first step. The Vance Legacy Grant was more than just money. It was a lifeline. It was the solid ground beneath Eleanor's feet after years of treading water in a stormy sea. The first thing she did was move. She found a small, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it was safe. The building had a small, shared patch of grass out back where Daisy could play, and the windows let in the bright afternoon sun. For the first time since Daisy was born, Eleanor felt like she could truly breathe. She established a strict routine. During the day, her life was entirely devoted to Daisy. They went to the park, visited the local library for story time, and spent hours on the living room floor building towers with colorful blocks. Daisy, sensing the profound shift in her mother's spirit, blossomed. Her babbling turned into first words, and her wobbly first steps became confident little runs. But after she tucked Daisy into her crib each night, a different Eleanor emerged. She would make a pot of strong coffee, sit at the small desk she'd bought at a second-hand store, and open her laptop. With the grant covering her tuition, she had enrolled in an online business administration program at the local community college. The coursework was challenging, and her brain often felt fuzzy with exhaustion after a long day of chasing a toddler. But as she worked through spreadsheets and read chapters on management principles, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building. She often thought of the anonymous benefactor who had made all this possible. In her mind, he was a kind, elderly man, perhaps a veteran himself, who wanted to leave a positive mark on the world. She wrote a heartfelt letter of thanks and gave it to Mrs. Gable at the community center, hoping it would find its way to him. She wanted him to know that his gift had not been wasted. She was honoring her great-grandfather's legacy by seizing this opportunity with both hands and holding on tight. She never once connected this faceless philanthropist with the kind-eyed stranger from the megamart. That memory was tucked away in a different part of her heart, a cherished, standalone moment of grace that had no connection to her new reality. 3 months after she received the grant, Eleanor got a call from Mrs. Gable. "Eleanor, dear, I have a small favor to ask," the director said, her voice warm and persuasive. "We're hosting a small reception next Friday evening. It's to officially launch the Vance Legacy Grant and to thank the donors who made it possible. As the first recipient, it would mean the world to us if you would attend and perhaps say a few words. Just a few minutes about what this program has meant to you and Daisy." Eleanor's stomach immediately tied itself in a knot. Public speaking was her worst nightmare. "Oh, Mrs. Gable, I don't know," she stammered. "I'm not very good at that sort of thing. I wouldn't know what to say." "Just speak from the heart, dear," Mrs. Gable encouraged. "You are the living proof of why this program matters. And our main benefactor will be there. He's a very private man, but he's making a rare appearance. I know he would be so moved to hear your story in person." The mention of the benefactor changed everything. This was her chance, her only chance, to thank him face to face. The thought terrified her, but she knew she had to do it. "Okay, Mrs. Gable," she said, taking a deep breath. "I'll be there." The week leading up to the event was a blur of anxiety. Eleanor wrote and rewrote a short speech a dozen times, the words never feeling quite right. She worried about what to wear, finally settling on a simple, dark blue dress she found on the clearance rack at a department store. It was the first new piece of clothing she had bought for herself in years. On the night of the reception, she dropped a chattering Daisy off with her trusted neighbor and drove her old, sputtering car to the community center. The event was being held in the main hall, which had been decorated with simple white tablecloths and small bouquets of flowers. It was a modest affair, filled with local community leaders, veterans, and their families. Eleanor felt terribly out of place. She clutched her small purse, her palms sweating, and scanned the room for a friendly face. And then she saw him. He was standing across the room, talking to a city councilman. He was wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, but he had the same quiet, thoughtful expression she remembered so clearly. It was James, the man from the grocery store. Her heart gave a sudden, powerful lurch, a mixture of shock and a strange, unbidden flutter of excitement. What was he doing here? Was he a donor? A volunteer? He must have felt her eyes on him, because he turned his head and his gaze met hers across the crowded room. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a slow, gentle smile that made her feel, for a moment, as if they were the only two people there. He excused himself from his conversation and began to make his way toward her. With every step he took, Eleanor's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle, pieces she hadn't even known existed, began to click into place with a dizzying speed. A major benefactor who preferred to remain anonymous. A man who was making a rare public appearance. A program named after her own family. It couldn't be. The idea was too impossible, too much like a fairy tale. "Eleanor," he said as he reached her, his voice just as kind as she remembered. "It's so good to see you again." "James," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he said, his smile widening slightly. "Though I think I might have an idea." Just then, Mrs. Gable bustled over to them, her face beaming. "Ah, I see you two have met. Eleanor, this is Mr. James Caldwell. He's the man I was telling you about. The man we all have to thank for the Vance Legacy Grant." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eleanor stared at James, her mouth slightly agape, unable to form a single word. It was him. The man who bought her formula was the same man who had given her a future. All this time, it had been him. The two separate acts of kindness that had so profoundly changed her life were not separate at all. They were two parts of the same incredible story. "You?" she finally whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. James's expression softened. He could see the storm of emotions on her face. The shock, the confusion, the gratitude. "Maybe we could step outside for a moment," he suggested gently. "It's a little quieter." He led her through a side door onto a small, empty patio. The cool night air was a welcome relief. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the muted sounds of the reception drifting through the open door. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. "Why? Why would you do all of this?" James leaned against the brick wall, his hands in his pockets. He looked up at the star-filled sky before turning his gaze back to her. "It's complicated, Eleanor. But it started a long time ago, before either of us were born. My grandfather was Corporal Thomas Caldwell. He served in the same division as your great-grandfather." He told her the story then. He told her about the battle, about Sergeant Michael Vance's incredible bravery, about how her great-grandfather had saved his grandfather's life and the lives of a dozen other men. "My grandfather never forgot that day," James said, his voice low and full of emotion. "He spent his whole life feeling a debt of gratitude he could never repay. He taught me that we have a responsibility to honor the people who came before us, to carry their legacy forward. When I saw you in the store that night, I didn't know who you were. I just saw a mother who needed a little help. But later, when I found out you were Michael Vance's great-granddaughter, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was a chance for my family to finally honor the debt we owed yours." Eleanor listened, completely captivated. The story washed away any feelings of shame or obligation she might have had. This wasn't charity. It was something deeper, something sacred. It was a bond forged in the crucible of war, an echo of heroism that had reached across the decades to touch her own life. "My whole life, I've heard stories about him," Eleanor said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He was just a picture on a bookshelf, a legend. You've made him real for me. Thank you. You're the one building the legacy now, Eleanor," James said, his voice sincere. "You're taking this opportunity and creating a future for you and Daisy. That's the greatest honor you could pay him." A comfortable silence settled between them again. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel intimidated by him. She didn't see a billionaire. She saw the grandson of Thomas Caldwell, a man trying to honor his family's past. And he didn't see a charity case. He saw the great-granddaughter of Michael Vance, a strong, resilient woman with a fire in her eyes. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a sharp, feminine voice. "James, there you are? I've been looking all over for you." A woman appeared in the doorway. She was tall and elegant, dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than Eleanor's rent for an entire year. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her smile was bright but didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Penelope," James said, his own smile becoming slightly more formal. "I was just getting some air. This is Eleanor Vance." "Eleanor, this is Penelope Covington. She's on the center's board of directors." Penelope's eyes swept over Eleanor, taking in her simple dress and her second-hand shoes in a single, dismissive glance. "Vance?" she said, the name sounding like a question. "Oh, you're the recipient. How lovely." The word recipient was coated in a thin veneer of condescension. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Eleanor said, extending a hand. Penelope ignored it, her attention already back on James. "They're about to start the speeches, darling. And you promised you'd sit at my table." She tucked her arm through his, a clear gesture of ownership. James looked uncomfortable. He gently extracted his arm from her grip. "I'll be in shortly, Penelope. I need to speak with Eleanor." Penelope's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. "Of course. Don't be long." She gave Eleanor one last, lingering look, an unspoken warning passing between them, before she turned and disappeared back inside. The warmth of the moment had been shattered. Eleanor suddenly felt self-conscious and out of place all over again. "I'm sorry about that," James said, a note of apology in his voice. "It's fine," Eleanor said, though it wasn't. "I should probably go inside. I think I'm supposed to give a speech." The thought now filled her with a fresh wave of terror. "You'll be wonderful," James said, his encouraging gaze meeting hers. "Just speak from the heart. That's all anyone needs to hear." He was right. As Eleanor stood at the podium a few minutes later, looking out at the small crowd, she didn't see a room full of strangers. She saw her great-grandfather's legacy. She saw Daisy's future. And in the front row, she saw James, his eyes full of a quiet, steady support that gave her the strength she needed. And so she spoke. Eleanor took a deep, shaky breath and looked out at the faces staring back at her. Her prepared speech, the one she had agonized over for a week, felt like a distant memory. The carefully chosen words and practiced phrases evaporated from her mind, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth of her experience. So that is what she gave them. She spoke not as a recipient, but as a mother. Her voice, though quiet, resonated with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She told them about the crushing weight of trying to provide for her daughter, about the shame she felt in the grocery store, and about the impossible choice between a baby's needs and an empty wallet. She spoke of her great-grandfather, not as a distant hero from a history book, but as the man whose legacy of courage she tried to live up to every single day, even in her darkest moments. "This grant," she said, her eyes finding James in the crowd, "is more than financial support. It's a message. It's a message that says we see you. It says that the sacrifices of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have not been forgotten. It says that their legacy is not just a statue in a park or a name on a plaque, but it lives on in the opportunities we create for their children." She finished by simply saying, "Thank you for giving my daughter a future. And thank you for giving me back my hope." When she stepped away from the podium, the room was completely silent for a beat. Then, a wave of applause erupted, warm and sincere. Several older veterans in the audience were dabbing their eyes. As Eleanor made her way back to her seat, her legs feeling like jelly, a number of people reached out to shake her hand, to pat her on the shoulder, to thank her for her honesty. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged. James was waiting for her, his eyes shining with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. It looked like pride. "I told you you'd be wonderful," he murmured, his voice for her ears only. Across the room, Penelope Covington watched this exchange, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. She saw the way James looked at Eleanor, with a warmth and admiration he had never shown her. She saw the genuine respect Eleanor had earned from the community leaders in the room. In Penelope's meticulously ordered world, where status and wealth were the only currencies that mattered, Eleanor Vance was an anomaly, an unacceptable disruption. And Penelope was not a woman who tolerated disruptions. In the weeks that followed, a subtle but poisonous campaign began. Penelope, a master of social and political maneuvering, started planting seeds of doubt among the other board members of the community center. She never attacked Eleanor directly. Her methods were far more insidious. During a budget review meeting, she would sigh and say, "I'm just a little concerned about the oversight for this new Vance grant. It seems a large sum to be awarded to a single individual based on a personal recommendation." She would corner other members in the hallway, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It's a lovely story, of course, but we must be careful about appearances. We wouldn't want the public to think our donations are being used to benefit the personal friends of our benefactors." The implication was clear and ugly. Eleanor was not a deserving recipient, but an object of James Caldwell's pity or, worse, his affection. She was a gold digger who had manipulated a lonely billionaire, and James, in his grief, was using the center's funds to pursue her. The narrative was cruel, false, and deeply damaging. Mrs. Gable, who was fiercely protective of both Eleanor and the grant program, tried to shut the rumors down, but Penelope was too powerful. Finally, Mrs. Gable had no choice but to call an official board meeting to review the allocation process and future of the Vance Legacy Grant. She called Eleanor the day before the meeting, her voice heavy with worry. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor," she said. "Penelope Covington is questioning the integrity of the program. She's trying to have the grant suspended, pending a review. I'm afraid she might succeed." Eleanor felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The life she had so carefully begun to build felt like it was about to be shattered. The shame and humiliation of Penelope's accusations were a physical blow. But then, a different feeling rose up to meet the fear, a hot, fierce anger. This wasn't just about her. Penelope was tarnishing her great-grandfather's name. She was trying to tear down a program that could help countless other families. The Eleanor of a few months ago would have crumbled. But this Eleanor, the one who had found her voice, would not go down without a fight. "When is the meeting?" she asked, her voice steady. The next afternoon, Eleanor walked into the community center's boardroom. All eyes turned to her. Penelope sat at the head of the long table, looking surprised and annoyed by Eleanor's presence. James was there, too, sitting at the far end, his face grim. Penelope began the meeting, her voice smooth and professional. She spoke of fiduciary duty, of donor confidence, of the need for transparent and unimpeachable processes. She never mentioned Eleanor by name, but everyone in the room knew who she was talking about. "All I am suggesting," Penelope concluded, giving the other board members a look of sincere, feigned concern, "is that we pause this particular initiative until a more rigorous and impartial selection committee can be formed. It is simply a matter of good governance." A heavy silence filled the room. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. They were good people, but they were intimidated by Penelope's influence. Before anyone could speak, Eleanor stood up. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am this single individual and the personal friend that Mrs. Covington is so concerned about." She looked directly at Penelope. "You talk about governance and process, but what you're really doing is trying to punish me because you believe I am unworthy. You look at me and you see a poor single mother, someone who doesn't belong in your world. You see a charity case, but you don't see a person. You don't see a great-granddaughter who is trying to honor a hero's legacy." She turned to the rest of the board. "This grant is not about me. It's for every family that has sacrificed. It's for every child whose parent or grandparent served this country. To suspend it, to bury it in reviews and committees because one person disapproves of its first recipient, would be an insult to every single one of them." Penelope scoffed. "This is all very emotional, Ms. Vance, but it doesn't change the facts. The fact is, you had a pre-existing, personal relationship with our primary benefactor. The optics are, to put it mildly, inappropriate." "You're right," a deep voice said from the end of the table. James stood up. "Our families do have a pre-existing relationship. It goes back more than 70 years. He walked to the head of the table and placed a worn, leather-bound journal on the polished wood. He opened it to a bookmark page. "This was my grandfather's journal," he said to the stunned board members. "Corporal Thomas Caldwell. In it, he describes, in great detail, the day his life was saved by a sergeant named Michael Vance. He writes here," James said, his finger tracing the faded ink, "He was the bravest man I ever knew. I owe him my life, a debt I can never repay." James then laid out several photographs and documents. A grainy black and white photo of a group of young soldiers, his grandfather and Eleanor's great-grandfather standing side by side. Official military commendations detailing Sergeant Vance's heroism. The Vance Legacy Grant is not an act of charity, James said, his voice ringing with authority and conviction. It is the long-overdue payment of a debt of honor from the Caldwell family to the Vance family. Eleanor Vance is not a recipient of my pity. She is the heir to a legacy of courage that my family has a sacred duty to acknowledge. To suggest anything else, to imply that this is anything other than what it is a dishonor to the memory of these two men. The room was utterly silent. Penelope's face was pale, her carefully constructed narrative completely demolished by the simple, powerful truth. She had been exposed, her petty jealousy laid bare for all to see. She had attacked with innuendo and suspicion, and James had answered with history and honor. There was nothing more to say. The board voted unanimously not only to continue the Vance Legacy Grant, but to work with James's foundation to expand it, making it a permanent pillar of the community center's mission. Penelope Covington quietly resigned from the board a week later. 2 years passed. The world kept turning, but for Eleanor, everything had changed. She had earned her degree in business administration, graduating at the top of her class. True to his word, James had hired her to work at his family's philanthropic foundation. Her primary role was to run and expand the program she had once been the sole recipient of. The Vance Legacy Grant had now helped over a dozen families of veterans get a fresh start, providing them with the same hope and opportunity that had been given to her. On a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon, Eleanor and James sat on a large blanket in a park. A few feet away, a 7-year-old Sophia and a 3-year-old Daisy were playing, their happy shrieks of laughter filling the air. They looked for all the world like sisters. Eleanor leaned her head on James's shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. Their relationship had grown slowly, organically, built not on grand romantic gestures, but on a foundation of shared values, mutual respect, and a deep, quiet understanding. He had become her partner, her confidant, her family. "You know," Eleanor said, watching Daisy chase a butterfly, "I still sometimes think about that woman in the grocery store, the one who was so lost and scared." James wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I think about her too," he said softly. "And I think about the man who was so lonely he had forgotten what real connection felt like." He looked from the girls' smiling faces to the confident, peaceful woman beside him. "You didn't just build a new life for yourself, Eleanor. You built one for me too. You reminded me what legacy truly means. It isn't about the money you leave behind. It's about the lives you touch." She turned and smiled at him, a smile full of a love that was as steady and as true as the legacy their grandfathers had forged so many years ago. The journey had been unexpected, the path forged by hardship and grace. But here, in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the quiet joy of the family they had built, she knew they were exactly where they were always meant to be. It had all started with an act of kindness in a grocery store, a single moment that proved a debt of honor never expires, and that the quietest acts of love can echo the loudest through generations. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.